It was Russia's largest mechanized assault of the fall. On October 27, 2025, approximately 29 armored vehicles began a push toward the Ukrainian villages of Shakhove and Volodymyrivka in what Moscow hoped would be a breakthrough operation. Beginning near the strategically vital city of Dobropilya in the Donetsk Oblast, Russian forces began to grind their way to the two villages in an assault that would take more than 6 hours. But instead of a hard-fought victory, the effort became yet another symbol of Russia's declining military effectiveness and strategic desperation. Here's how Russia's biggest autumn offensive turned into 6 hours of sheer hell with nothing to show for it at the end. The assault began in the early morning hours, Russian planners taking advantage of the dense fog and wet terrain in the hopes of hampering Ukrainian drone operations and limiting aerial detection. Russian commanders deployed their forces in an unconventional pattern, with small scattered groups of 4 or 5 vehicles, each advancing on a staggered schedule. Previously, as some Ukrainian commanders noted, this tactic was employed by Russia solely for infantry pushes rather than mechanized infantry and vehicle offensives. Apparently, Russia had decided to try something new and more adaptive in its offensives, befitting a relatively large attack. But Ukrainian defenders were ready. The 1st National Guard Corps Azov, alongside the Army's 33rd and 93rd separate mechanized brigades, had prepared extensively for assaults throughout the area, including for the possibility of a broader use of vehicles as frontline forces. Pre-positioned engineering obstacles, carefully placed minefields, and coordinated fire control zones turned the battlefield into a test of Russian armor. Ukrainian artillery units and drone operators seamlessly cooperated to systematically destroy vehicle after vehicle as Russian forces attempted to penetrate defensive lines. The results were catastrophic for Moscow. After more than 6 hours of sustained combat, not a single Russian unit achieved its objective. Ukrainian forces repelled the entire assault, inflicting some of the most significant daily losses to an army that is already hemorrhaging personnel and equipment at unsustainable rates. The 29 armored vehicles that represented Russia's autumn offensive power were either destroyed, damaged, or forced to retreat, with supporting infantry hunted down by Ukrainian FPV and bomber drones as they attempted to establish positions in the forest belts surrounding the target villages. Both Azov and the 33rd Mechanized posted videos on Telegram with clear images of drones dismantling Russian positions one by one. Some of the clips clearly show Russian tracks across the muddy fields while surrounded by Ukrainian drones. At many points, the drone footage cuts out suddenly, indicative of a successful detonation that damages the tank and throws shrapnel around the nearby area. Notably, most of the vehicles appear not to be tanks but infantry support vehicles, suggesting that Russia has been slowly running out of main battle tanks that served as the main invasion force in the war. The offensive wasn't an isolated incident, but just another indicator of how Russia seems to be losing all momentum throughout the year. Just 2 weeks earlier, on October 13th, Russian forces had attempted a similar assault in the same area, losing 9 infantry fighting vehicles, 4 MTLBs, 3 tanks, and 3 motorcycles. The fact that Russia returned to the same battlefield with slightly modified tactics speaks volumes about the rigid, inflexible nature of Russian military planning and the severe constraints now limiting their operational capabilities. While the small unit infiltration approach represented a change from earlier mass armor assaults, the execution demonstrated fundamental weaknesses in Russian combined arms operations. Russian forces increased their tank deployment for this operation, indicating a return to traditional armored warfare after months of costly infantry assaults. The vehicles used so-called anti-drone mesh, which is cage armor crudely welded onto tanks and infantry fighting vehicles in a desperate attempt to counter Ukraine's dominant drone superiority. While anti-drone netting or cages can slightly reduce a tank's susceptibility to drone operations, specifically from above, they proved largely ineffective against Ukrainian hunter-killer drone teams that have perfected their tactics over 3.5 years of combat. The Russian plan involved advancing in small groups along several routes to split Ukrainian defenses and allow follow-up forces to exploit any breakthroughs. In theory, this approach made sense. Rather than presenting a single massive target for Ukrainian artillery and drones, Russian commanders hoped that simultaneous attacks from different directions would overwhelm defenders and create confusion. But in practice, Ukrainian forces demonstrated exactly why this tactic was doomed from the start. The 33rd Separate Mechanized Brigade reported that they identified at least 6 Russian vehicles approaching Volodymyrivka in the morning, which was over 20% of the invading force. Using a combination of traditional optical surveillance and drone reconnaissance, Ukrainian forces could also practically track Russian movements from the moment they left their deployment areas. And when these same Russian vehicles attempted to drop infantry into forest belts on the village outskirts, They were immediately engaged by coordinated artillery fire and drone strikes. This tactical approach simply continued the pattern of losses that started in late August, when Ukraine started its own counteroffensive and retook more than a dozen villages in the area. To lower the hemorrhaging of troops, Russian forces previously relied on small unit infiltration tactics, with some reportedly managing to enter the city limits of Pokrovsk, which is considered a crucial target in the region. This new shift to mechanized small unit tactics by Russia, however, creates new problems, as shown in this attack. While deploying smaller units may make them less vulnerable to mass artillery strikes, it also means that each group lacked the combat power necessary to overwhelm prepared defensive positions. Ukrainian defenders could defeat each small assault individually, turning what was supposed to be simultaneous pressure from multiple directions into a series of isolated engagements. And under these new terms, Ukraine could have its pick of targets while Russian soldiers were still busy scrambling to find vantage positions in the middle of barren fields or forests under constant surveillance. But there's also one huge issue to unpack here. The attack had 29 vehicles and yet was considered a significant concentration of power by 2025 standards. This being the largest offensive of the season speaks volumes about how much Russian capabilities have fallen. For comparison, Russia's summer 2024 offensive around Pokrovsk regularly featured 2 assaults with 98 vehicles between September 12th and September 19th, supported by extensive artillery preparation and air support. A report echoed by Times Radio suggested losses of over 100 vehicles per week in the area a year before. So when the sight of only 29 vehicles qualifies as a major operation, and that modest force achieves practically nothing, it's safe to say that Russia seems to be running out of steam. The assault also highlighted Russia's continued inability to effectively integrate air power with ground operations. Despite Russia's supposed air superiority on paper, Ukrainian defenders reported minimal air support for the attacking forces. Russian fixed-wing aircraft remained largely absent from the battlefield, constrained by Ukraine's layered air defense network and the catastrophic losses Russia's air forces suffered over the 3.5 years of combat. The much-vaunted glide bomb attacks that caused such devastation in 2024 and were purportedly improved upon as late as August this year were notably absent this time round, suggesting either ammunition shortages, delivery system problems, or simply the recognition that Ukrainian air defenses around Dobropilya have become too formidable to risk valuable aircraft. Ukraine, meanwhile, funneled Russian forces into pre-planned kill zones. Minefields forced Russian vehicles into narrow corridors where they became easy targets for anti-tank guided missiles and FPV drones. Artillery fire was carefully coordinated to prevent Russian forces from consolidating or establishing fire support positions. And when Russian infantry dismounted from their vehicles, Ukrainian drone operators were waiting for those exact moments to strike, hunting individuals and small groups through forest belts with bomber drones and FPV systems. The result was a perfect defense. Not a single Russian unit succeeded in establishing a foothold in either Shakhove or Volodymyrivka. The assault culminated with a breakthrough without territorial gain and without any operational benefit to offset the heavy losses in personnel and equipment. Of course, this is unlikely to be the last attack in the area, and the frequency of these ineffective strategies might increase as the end of 2025 closes in. Russia keeps throwing forces at this sector despite repeated catastrophic failures because Pokrovsk has become one of the major strategic centers for Ukrainian defenses and unites the country's efforts in the region. Its fall would represent a strategic disaster that could reshape the war's trajectory, which is precisely what the Russians are hoping for. You see, Pokrovsk sits at the intersection of multiple critical supply highways and houses one of the most important railway hubs in eastern Ukraine. Every Ukrainian defensive position across a huge swathe of Donetsk Oblast depends on supplies that flow through Pokrovsk transportation network. Ammunition, fuel, reinforcements, medical supplies, food, and everything that keeps Ukrainian forces fighting in the east passes through this critical logistics node. If Russia were to capture Pokrovsk, it could open up the entire Donetsk front. Should the city fall into Russian hands, Ukrainian troops stationed further east would likely struggle with major supply shortages. Ukraine's ability to quickly reinforce threatened areas via road and rail networks would be lost, cutting off support. As a result, Ukrainian forces might have to retreat while fighting, leaving behind well-fortified positions that Russia fought hard to take. This loss would force Ukraine to create a new defensive line much further west, giving up hundreds of square miles not because of enemy attacks, but due to their inability to resupply. But there's more at stake than just military logistics. Pokrovsk's capture would advance Russian President Vladimir Putin's declared war aim of completely occupying Donetsk Oblast. Since the invasion began, Moscow has consistently framed its objectives in terms of liberating Ukraine from Western influences and fascist tendencies. When the broad target of the entirety of Ukraine failed to be captured, the Donbass region was assessed as a suitable fallback plan. The region was chosen due to a large concentration of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, with the oxymoron notwithstanding, which Russian propaganda spun as needing to be liberated from Ukrainian tyranny. Consequently, Russian plans turned to controlling the entire administrative boundaries of Donetsk and Luhansk. Currently, Russia controls only portions of Donetsk, and every map showing incomplete occupation is a daily reminder to Putin that his special military operation has failed to achieve even its most basic stated objectives. This creates immense political pressure within Russia's leadership. Putin has staked his regime's legitimacy on victory in Ukraine. He desperately needs something he can present to the Russian people as success. Full control of Donetsk would allow Russian propagandists to declare mission accomplished, to claim that Russia has achieved its goals of denazifying and demilitarizing the Donbass, regardless of the catastrophic price paid. The economic dimension is equally important. Donetsk Oblast, despite the devastation of war, still contains valuable industrial infrastructure, agricultural land, and mineral resources. The region historically produced coal, steel, and chemicals that were vital to Ukraine's economy. While much of this infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed, control of the territory would give Russia access to whatever remains and the potential to rebuild in the future. More importantly, denying these resources to Ukraine advances Russia's strategy of crippling Ukraine's economic base and long-term viability as an independent state. There's also a geopolitical calculation at work, because Russian military planners understand that time is not on their side. Every month the war continues is another month of economic decline for Russia, another month of casualties that can't be easily replaced, another month for Ukraine and President Volodymyr Zelensky to come up with new weapons or get donations from the increasingly confident NATO. Russian military leadership appears to believe that if they can capture Pokrovsk and complete the occupation of Donetsk before their offensive capabilities collapse entirely, they can force Ukraine into negotiations from a position of relative strength. This is supported by the fact that most of President Donald Trump's suggestions regarding the creation of a frozen conflict should be done along the current battle lines rather than forcing reparations or Russia's retreat. By getting complete control of the occupied part of Donetsk through a ceasefire agreement ratified by NATO, Putin could even potentially claim victory, secure the contested territorial gains, and avoid the domestic fallout stemming from a contracted economy and loss of confidence in his government. This explains why Russia continues to assault the Pokrovsk-Dobropilya corridor despite horrific losses. From the Kremlin's perspective, there is no acceptable alternative to continuing the attacks. Abandoning the offensive would mean admitting that Russia can't even achieve its reduced territorial objectives. Russian commanders likely even know that the attacks will fail and that they will lose most, if not all, units and equipment, or be forced to retreat limping and bleeding, figuratively or literally, until they can create another, largest autumn offensive a few weeks later. But they also know that Putin demands progress, that the political leadership expects Donetsk to fall, and that failure to make at least some forward momentum could have career or life-ending consequences for Russian military officers. Ukrainian defenders, for their part, understand exactly what they're fighting for. Pokrovsk has the ideal terrain to be defended via drones and artillery, composed mainly of open fields and farmland with little to no room to create makeshift fortifications or hiding spots. This is made even better in autumn or spring when rain or thaw creates more muddy terrain to slow down infantry and vehicle operations. The added military stations in Dobropilya allow the two settlements to effectively protect each other remotely. The existing road and rail infrastructure, meanwhile, permits a steady stream of supplies from the rest of the country. The terrain is suited to mechanized infantry, but natural bottlenecks near the city produce similar conditions as seen on the daily maps. While Pokrovsk has been encroached on from three sides, few offensives have actually made it closer than a few miles away from the city. Meanwhile, Ukraine's full control of the northwest is slowing Russia's momentum significantly. So long as the city itself stands, Ukraine can keep the incoming Russian forces under control, because as soon as Russians enter and capture the city entirely, those same conditions will make a Ukrainian counteroffensive that much more difficult to accomplish. The increase in Russian tank employment in this operation is a potentially significant tactical shift, however one that could spell trouble for either side of the conflict. Between October 20th and 25th, Russian forces conducted 41 armored vehicle-supported assaults across the entire front line, with a notable concentration of tank-led attacks in the Pokrovsk sector. This is a departure from the infantry-heavy meat wave tactics that dominated Russian operations throughout much of 2025, even though they technically bore fruit in June and July. On the surface, the switch to mechanized operations could appear to be a sign of Russian forces returning to more conventional combined arms tactics. Remember, while Russia lost a lot of tanks and people, it still likely has many more vehicles in storage and can pull from a much larger pool of recruits than Ukraine. But both of these require time, money, effort, and would reveal the exact extent of losses to the Russian public, none of which Russia really has or wants. In reality, this is likely among the final attempts to achieve meaningful territorial gains before Russian offensive capabilities collapse entirely or winter weather makes large-scale operations impossible. One reason for the push at this time is the sheer number of tanks that Russia can actually deploy to the front lines. According to some estimates, Russia can theoretically produce around 300 of its most advanced tanks in active service, the T-90M. A report by the Conflict Intelligence Team suggested that Russia has already run out of older T-90A chassis that were then upgraded to T-90M standards, and that most of the tanks currently being built were custom-made with new parts and technologies. Additionally, Jane's, an open-source defense intelligence outlet, has identified that T-90 and T-80 tanks have been significantly more present on the battlefield than they were in 2022. According to visual data, 23 units have the T-80 tank, while only 3 units used the model in 2022. For the T-90, only 2 units had the tank 3 years ago, and that number skyrocketed to 20. But despite wider adoption, Russia still seems hesitant to deploy tanks to the battlefield. Namely, most of the vehicles actually being used for offensives over the past few months aren't main battle tanks at all, but infantry support vehicles, which don't carry nearly as much offensive armament. On the other side, when Ukraine does seem to use its tanks, it uses T-72s, or even obsolete museum pieces, to provide cover and soak up artillery strikes to give infantry units time to strike. This stems from production not being able to keep up with demand, even with the increased production rate, which has been predicted to go over 1,000 tanks annually by 2029, Russia can't keep up with the losses. According to Oryx, Russia has been confirmed to have lost just over 4,200 tanks in 44 months, giving it a tank loss rate of over 1,130 per year. The production numbers simply can't cover the losses, but Russia still has plenty of tanks that are sitting in storage or undergoing repairs to be fit for the front. It's just a matter of whether Russia will prioritize short-term gains or long-term equipment recovery. Russian commanders have likely realized that their infantry-first tactics have stopped yielding the results necessary to keep up the momentum or even satisfy the domestic propaganda. So using tanks in a larger capacity is likely to be shown as renewed efforts to create crucial battlefield wins. If Russia does decide to dedicate more of its mechanized infantry resources to Pokrovsk, it could potentially overwhelm Ukrainian defenses. Additionally, the actual model of the tank or infantry support vehicle doesn't seem to make much of a difference when pitted against drone swarms, minefields, or combined Ukrainian tactics to divert available offensive routes to bottlenecks where armor becomes more of a hindrance than a solution. So Russia could theoretically use some of its older tanks to gain a short-term advantage, but there's also a darker interpretation. The increased use of armored forces in what might be Russia's final major push of 2025 could indicate that the Russian military and political leadership understand their window for offensive operations is rapidly closing. Every indicator suggests Russia's military is approaching a breaking point. While Russia has committed to making new tanks, it actually stopped producing the supposedly modern T-14 Armata and likely doesn't have many older tanks left to throw at the front line for cheap. Russian military exports have also dropped to insignificant levels, preventing the military-industrial complex from actually generating revenue and making it one of the biggest expenditures for Russian taxpayers to swallow. This comes at the same time as when Russia has been forced to lower its military budget for the first time in years and increase both personal and corporate taxes, suggesting an economy that's slowly being strangled of resources. If Russian leadership recognizes that reality, and there's considerable evidence they do, then the current offensive operations take on a different character. The new attack is part of a desperate race to capture as much territory as possible before Russian offensive capabilities degrade beyond the point where meaningful attacks are possible. Russian commanders may be operating under a timeline that gives them until the end of 2025 or perhaps early 2026 to secure territorial gains that could be translated into negotiating leverage. For Ukraine, these developments create both opportunity and danger. The opportunity lies in the recognition that Russia's desperate final push, if that's what this represents, can be defeated. Ukrainian forces have shown repeatedly that they can repel Russian assaults, even large ones, when properly supported and supplied. If Russia is indeed expending its last reserves of offensive power in pursuit of Pokrovsk and the completion of Donetsk's occupation, then defeating these attacks potentially ends Russia's ability to conduct any meaningful offensive operations, shifting the war into a new phase where Ukraine holds the initiative. The danger for Ukraine is that Russia might succeed. While Russia has been hemorrhaging resources, so has Ukraine, and its manpower crisis is similar, if not worse, than Russia's. Ukraine still needs continued Western military aid, particularly artillery ammunition, air defense systems, and the long-range strike weapons necessary to hit Russian logistics and staging areas. Without those supplies, even an inferior Russian military can potentially grind through Ukrainian defenses through sheer persistence, and if Russia decides to go all out, it might do so by channeling all of its military and even possibly smaller nuclear warheads to do so. A larger-scale attack or actual deployment of a tactical warhead could force Ukraine to completely abandon the prospect of defending Donbass, which means the next few months will be vital to the outcome of the war. It remains to be seen whether Ukraine can keep up the momentum of repelling Russian attacks. If it does, Russia's internal problems might force the war to an end without needing a ceasefire or peace agreement. The country will just combust by itself. Ukraine just pulled off a tactical masterclass, targeting a Russian dam in a recent drone strike and catching multiple units in a wild water trap they never saw coming. Now Russian soldiers, vehicles, and other assets are quite literally being swept away as water spills through the cracks in the dam, drowning any hope the Kremlin might have had about a big victory in the area. The incident occurred at the Belgorod Reservoir Dam in Russia's Belgorod region. Given that this region is right by Ukraine, with many miles of international border along its southern and eastern edges, it's a crucial location for the Kremlin's forces. Throughout the war so far, Russia has repeatedly launched assaults into Ukraine's Kharkiv and Luhansk regions from Belgorod, and Ukraine's forces have done what they can to conduct counter-operations, striking back at Russian soldiers along the border and carrying out long-range drone and missile attacks on high-value targets and important infrastructure across the region as well. Recently, Russian forces have been attempting to make a breakthrough and capture the Ukrainian city of Vovchansk, which was once home to around 17,500 people before the war began, but is now little more than a ghost town, with large parts of the city having been destroyed in the Russian Kharkiv offensive of 2024. However, despite being littered with rubble and debris, the city still has tactical value in the war for whichever side can control it for several significant reasons. Firstly, it's one of the biggest Ukrainian settlements right by the border with Russia. Controlling a place like that will be a big boost for the Kremlin's forces. They could fortify this location and use it as a forward base or foothold for further advances into the Kharkiv region. Plus, since Vovchansk is a city, it has much stronger supply lines compared to the much smaller settlements and villages dotted elsewhere along the border territories. The T2104 highway passes straight through the city, branching off to the southeast and southwest, and connecting Vovchansk with several other towns and cities deeper in Ukraine. Again, that's important, as it means that supplies, food, fuel, troops, and vehicles can easily get in and out of this location. It's thanks to that Ukraine's forces have been able to hold on to this city for so long, funneling fuel, ammunition, and other important resources into Vovchansk from other regions. If Russia were to take control of this city, then it too would benefit from those same transport links. Its commanders would find it easier to plan for their next steps along the highways and other roads and routes leading into and out of the city, identifying their next priority targets and potentially making speedy progress towards their next objectives. Rather than having to send out scouts and reconnaissance groups ahead to map out the terrain and pick a path through the rough ground, they will be able to simply deploy troops and vehicles right onto the road, covering ground more quickly and efficiently. Vovchansk also ties into Russia's reported plans to establish a buffer, or the so-called security zone, close to the international border. Vladimir Putin himself has spoken about this concept, suggesting that Russian forces should take control of a long stretch of borderlands in order to minimize the risk of any Ukrainian incursions in the future. In May of this year, Putin announced, "We have approved the creation of a necessary security buffer zone along our borders. Our armed forces are actively working to accomplish this task." The Russian president also specifically mentioned the Belgorod region as one of the locations that needed protecting, so it stands to reason that he would want his troops to take control of a border city like Vovchansk as soon as possible in order to fulfill that ambition. If Russia were to take control of Vovchansk, that would also have broader strategic implications for the war. It would force Ukraine to respond one way or another. Kyiv might decide, for example, to divert forces from other regions in order to fortify surrounding towns and cities to slow the Russian advance. It might also choose to commit additional resources to the area to stage some sort of counterattack in order to possibly regain control of the city. That, in turn, would most likely weaken other Ukrainian positions elsewhere along the front lines, potentially opening up additional gaps for Russia. Such is the nature of war. Every decision has consequences, every action has a reaction, and an event in one location can cause numerous knock-on effects for other regions, even those that are hundreds of miles away. Lastly, it's worth noting that a capture of Vovchansk would, quite frankly, be a relatively big win for Russian forces at this stage, since they have failed to capture a single major Ukrainian city since 2022. Despite Putin's best efforts and despite him throwing colossal amounts of cash, resources and manpower into this war, the Russian army's progress is remarkably slow, all along the front lines. It's taking only the slimmest slivers of land, often little more than muddy old farming fields or charred remains of tiny, no-name settlements, and it's doing so at great cost, with well over 1 million reported casualties at this stage, coupled with gigantic losses of equipment and an imminent economic collapse for the Kremlin to somehow deal with as well. In short, Russia needs some sort of win, some sort of sign that it's at least doing one thing right, and at this stage, it's so desperate that even catching a ravaged, rubble-strewn city might just feel like a cause for celebration. Thus, the Kremlin's commanders have committed quite a lot of resources to their Vovchansk offensive, with several major brigades and regiments reportedly operating in the area, including the 82nd Motor Rifle Regiment, the 2nd Guards Spetsnaz Brigade, the 128th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade, and the 138th Separate Guards Motor Rifle Brigade. Until quite recently, it appeared that Russia was making steady progress in the area, so much so that on October 26th, the head of the Russian army, General Valery Gerasimov, told Putin that Russian forces reportedly occupied around 70% of the city. He also made numerous other bold and either fabricated or exaggerated claims regarding Russian successes on the battlefield, many of which were instantly debunked by open-source intelligence groups, military analysts, and expert think tanks, like the Institute for the Study of War, which published a full analysis of the general's claims, stating, "ISW has not observed evidence to support Gerasimov's claims. ISW has only observed evidence to assess that Russian forces have seized roughly 23% of Vovchansk." Some of the Ukrainian troops who are actually on the ground in Vovchansk area also decided to share their take on events, with the 16th Army Corps of the Armed Forces of Ukraine writing online, "The enemy tried to take full advantage of a window of opportunity. After the lack of precipitation in the hellish summer, the Seversky Donetsk and Vovcha rivers became shallow, which simplified the enemy's logistics. Plus, it was possible to accumulate reserves and there were still enough leaves on the trees. All this led to a sharp increase in activity in the Vovchansk direction. The enemy managed to achieve local successes, but he did it at the cost of heavy losses. Some units almost completely lost combat readiness. For example, the 1st Battalion of the 82nd Motorized Rifle Regiment was almost wiped out to zero. In fact, only the command staff remained in the unit, so it had to be withdrawn to the rear for replenishment. In other words, it appears that any reports of Russian dominance in the Vovchansk sector have been wildly exaggerated. While Russian troops certainly did take advantage of favorable conditions in the area to make some small gains, they're still far from raising their flag above the city streets, and they have, according to Ukraine's accounts, suffered heavy losses in the process. And on October 24th, the situation swiftly became much, much worse for the Kremlin's forces fighting in and around Vovchansk. That was the day that Ukrainian troops began their attacks on the Belgorod Reservoir Dam. Reports soon emerged in Russian media stating that the dam had been hit by a Ukrainian missile strike, allegedly with the aid of a US-supplied HIMARS system. Several buildings containing technical equipment were damaged in the initial attack, as well as a lifting mechanism for one of the locks and the crest of the dam itself. It appears that Ukraine then followed up with a second wave strike the next day, October 25th, dealing additional damage to the dam with precision drone strikes. Cracks in key sections of the structure allowed a surge of water from the reservoir to flood through and into the land beyond. And this wasn't just a few drips and drops, it was an enormous amount of water, as confirmed in Russia's own Federal Water Resources Agency, which provided a statement to the state-owned media outlet TASS. The October 24th and 25th strikes on the Belgorod Reservoir Dam damaged the dewatering outlet, which is used for sanitary water drainage below the reservoir, and also caused both segmented gates to leak. As a result of the damage, the water level in the reservoir dropped by 1 meter. The TASS report also revealed that repair and restoration work had been ordered at the dam, with dozens of technicians and multiple trucks and other vehicles dispatched to the area. But when dams burst, break, or crack, the consequences are usually immediate, as water simply doesn't wait around for the authorities to react. It flows fast and freely in any available direction, leaving almost no time at all for anyone to stop it. Thus, it didn't take long after the attacks for flood reports to start rolling in from various villages along the Seversky Donetsk as a vast wave of reservoir water washed their way. Local authorities in Russia's Shebekino district reported flooding in at least 10 areas and also announced partial evacuations of affected sectors, with Belgorod's regional governor, Vyacheslav Gladkov, sharing the news on his official Telegram account. As a result of the strike by the Ukrainian armed forces, the dam of the Belgorod Reservoir has been damaged. We understand that the enemy may attempt another attack and destroy the dam. If this happens, there will be a risk of flooding the river floodplain from the Kharkiv region and several streets in our villages, home to approximately 1,000 residents. Therefore, we are starting to offer temporary accommodations in Belgorod to residents who are at risk of flooding and who have no other options for temporary accommodation. But it was the Kremlin's army, rather than the local residents and civilians, who suffered most. In the blink of an eye, a multitude of Russian trenches and dugouts were turned to swamps, with images and videos swiftly spreading across social media, revealing the full extent of the flooding. A compilation of clips filmed by Russian soldiers was shared on X by War Translated, along with the caption, "Russian equipment and dugouts are literally going underwater in the Shebekino area and along the Vovchansk axis after a dam burst in the Belgorod region. The occupiers are whining that they now have to swim to reach their positions." The videos show an entire road submerged with water and several vehicles completely stuck in the mud, unable to advance, as well as collapsing river crossing point and several drenched Russian trenches, with one soldier stating, "After the Belgorod Dam broke, we went from being infantry to Marines in a day, but we were lucky. At the neighboring position, the entire dugout was flooded, along with the equipment." Certain Russian positions appeared to be entirely submerged, according to available data and open-source intelligence analysis, with the likes of vehicles, ammunition stocks, and fortifications literally washed away in the floodwaters. Satellite images of the area also indicate widespread flooding further downstream from the Belgorod Reservoir, with water levels seemingly continuing to rise, piling pressure on surrounding settlements and military units. This is much more than a minor inconvenience. Russian troops aren't simply having to deal with some wet clothes, muddy boots, and wrecked trenches. Some units are now entirely cut off from their supply lines, isolated, exposed, and at the mercy of Ukraine's forces in the area. Indeed, according to reports, several of Russia's military logistic routes have been completely wiped out by the flood, with units from no fewer than 4 brigades, the 68th, 116th, 128th, and 136th, all at risk of being wiped out in the days to follow. This was confirmed by the 16th Army Corps of the Armed Forces of Ukraine on Telegram, with Ukrainian soldiers explaining exactly how much the tide had quite literally turned in their favor following the dam attack. As of today, the situation is no longer in favor of the Russians. After the strike on the Belgorod Dam, the latter began leaking. According to Russian media, the reservoir's water level has dropped by 1 meter in just one day. As they say, the water went into the house, or rather, into the Seversky Donetsk, and there are already reports of the Russian dugouts being flooded. But the main thing is that enemy logistics are becoming significantly more complicated, so the units that managed to cross the Seversky Donetsk turned out to actually be cut off from the main forces. This was an astonishing display of tactical acumen from Ukraine. Its forces knew that they needed to think outside the box to slow Russia's advances in the region. They understood that the Kremlin was clearly committing a lot of troops and resources to the area, intent on taking control of Vovchansk by any means necessary. The Ukrainians accepted they most likely wouldn't be able to match Russia in the manpower department, so needed to find ways to even the odds, and they came up with a truly brilliant plan, something that other military forces all over the world would have struggled to even conceive of. Indeed, many militaries might have simply decided to dig in at Vovchansk, doing their best to hold the defensive line as long as possible, relying on supply lines and reinforcements to keep them going, but eventually, inevitably falling in the face of overwhelming adversity. Ukraine can't afford to think that way. It cannot simply sacrifice important pieces of land without doing everything in its power to hold them, and since it has fewer troops and resources than its enemy, it has to come up with innovative, unexpected ways to catch the Kremlin's forces off guard, and they most certainly achieved that here. Even the savviest of Russian commanders could never have predicted an attack like this. Knowing the approximate locations of Russian brigades, Ukraine seized a golden opportunity, striking the dam, flooding the region, and turning the situation in the sector upside down. Now, rather than thinking about pushing on and capturing the city, many Russian troops will simply be struggling to stay alive. With their supplies washed away, their trenches rendered entirely inhospitable, and their supply lines severed, they'll have fewer options available, forced to wade through the water in search of drier, safer ground. Many may not live to tell the tale, as Ukrainian units in the sector will more than likely be on the hunt for isolated Russian soldiers, eager to pick off or capture any stragglers in their sights and even the odds in the area. This in turn should ensure that Vovchansk remains firmly and conclusively in Ukrainian hands for at least the coming days and weeks, as it will inevitably take quite some time for Russia to recover from this. Repairing the dam alone could take several weeks, if not longer, and water may continue to flood through during that time, especially if the region suffers any spells of heavy rain. Alternatively, Ukraine might not even be finished with the dam just yet. Its forces could very well carry out yet another wave of drone or missile attacks on the structure, widening the cracks and worsening the floods downstream, leaving even more of Russia's soldiers stranded and struggling to stay afloat. In many ways, the incident is a microcosm of the entire war so far. It's a war that has, in many ways, been a David versus Goliath-like story, with a much larger, stronger, and more aggressive force attacking a seemingly smaller and weaker opponent. Just like Goliath, Russia has relied primarily on its brute strength in its quest for victory, pummeling Ukraine with drone swarms, missile salvos, and intense, relentless frontline assaults, using tanks, bombers, artillery, and more to pile pressure on its opponent. Ukraine, meanwhile, has played the part of David to perfection. Understanding it is the smaller and weaker of the two combatants, at least as far as numbers and statistics are concerned. It's been forced to think intelligently and strategically, identifying its enemy's weak points and exploiting them at every available opportunity. That's exactly what happened in Belgorod. Ukraine was partially on the ropes, but saw an opportunity to strike back and didn't let that chance pass by. It caught the enemy completely by surprise, and now it's reaping the rewards of its hard work and tactical planning. While Russian troops are wondering what went wrong as they're forced to abandon sinking vehicles and leave water-damaged supplies behind.
Oh well, another day, another Ukrainian drone strike on an oil refinery deep inside the Russian Federation. It's becoming a semi-regular occurrence. Ukrainian drones damage an oil refinery, long gas lines form in Crimea, Belgorod, Krasnodar Krai, and many other areas in Russia. And the world's energy superpower embarrassingly struggles to keep the gas flowing at its nation's pumps. This is certainly not what Russian President Vladimir Putin had in mind when he rubber-stamped Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. The war was supposed to end with a quick Ukrainian capitulation and the restoration of a Moscow-friendly client government. Almost 4 years later, Putin's nation is locked in a grinding, bloody war of attrition in eastern Ukraine and an even more destructive long-range tit-for-tat war of attrition of each other's energy facilities. Inside Russia, the effects of Ukraine's targeted strikes on Russia's oil refineries are mounting, with many Western analysts convinced that the country is imploding as a result. Here's a closer look at the damage Ukraine is causing, how Russia is trying to respond, and what it means for the outcome of the conflict. Now, since August, Ukrainian strikes have targeted at least 16 of Russia's 38 oil refineries with more than 24 attacks. The latest to be successfully hit was the Ryazan oil refinery on October 23. The plant, which supplies fuel to the Moscow Oblast, is Russia's fourth largest oil refinery. It processed 13.1 million tons of oil in 2024 and accounted for 5% of Russia's total refinery capacity, according to Russian estimates. Following the attack, the third in 2025, a fire broke out at the plant after the CDU4 primary processing unit, which had a capacity of 4 million tons per year or 80,000 barrels per day. There was so much damage that the refinery had to be shut down, which led to the suspension of operations at several neighboring units, including a reformer, vacuum gas oil hydro treater, and catalytic cracker. The previous night, a Ukrainian drone attack hit the Dagnotech oil refinery in Makhachkala, Dagestan, more than 850 miles away from the Ryazan strike. A source in the Ukrainian military intelligence told the Kyiv Independent that the AVT's primary oil processing unit had been disabled and a large-scale fire had broken out. The refinery is significantly smaller, with a capacity of 1 million tons per year. Still, it's an integral part of Russia's southern energy chain, supporting military logistics toward the Caucasus, including the Caspian Fleet. The refinery, which previously belonged to the family of Magmomed Sultan Magmomedov, the controversial former Secretary of State of Dagestan, was transferred to the state in August after the discovery of massive fraud and corruption. A few nights earlier, on October 19, it was double trouble for Russia's oil refineries. First, at least one Ukrainian drone hit the Novokuybishevsk oil refinery in Samara Oblast, the second such strike in a matter of weeks. The strike caused a massive fire that damaged the main primary crude processing unit, AVT-11, a large gasoline tank, and an electrical transformer. That led to the complete suspension of both primary oil refining units at the plant. The first, AVT-11, has a capacity of 18,900 tons per day, while the second, AVT-9, has a capacity of 4,700 tons per day. Sources say the plant will be out of action until at least November. The same evening, also in western Russia, a Ukrainian drone strike hit the Orenburg gas processing plant in the village of Kolodnye Kiluchi in Orenburg. According to Reuters, this is the largest gas chemical complex on the planet, with a processing capacity of 37.5 billion cubic meters of gas per annum. The Orenburg area was also in Ukraine's crosshairs a few weeks earlier, when a drone hit the Orskneftiye Orgsyntez oil refinery, followed by a column of black smoke rising above the plant. The refinery is one of Russia's biggest, with an annual processing capacity of 6.6 million tons. Around 30 different types of petroleum products, including gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, bitumen, and fuel oil, are produced at the plant. On October 12, it was the Republic of Bashkortostan's turn to watch one of its major oil refineries go up in flames. This time, a Ukrainian drone hit one of the massive Bashneft refineries in the city of Ufa. The Bashneft conglomerate owns and operates 3 primary oil refineries in Ufa: Bashneft Ufa Nefteakim, Bashneft Novoil, and Bashneft UNPZ. Together, they form one of the largest oil refining complexes in Russia, with a combined refining capacity of around 500,000 barrels per day. The strike reportedly damaged the AVT-5 unit, the primary oil refining unit critical to the production process. Since the beginning of October, Ukrainian drones have also targeted the Antipinsky refinery in Tyumen, Slavnet Yanos in Yaroslavl, Rosneft's Tuapse refinery, and the Kinef refinery in the Leningrad region. A fire at Kinef forced the shutdown of its main unit, accounting for about 40% of its processing capacity. That's not to mention a massive strike on the Feodosia oil terminal in Crimea on October 13, where long-range drones hit at least 5 storage tanks. The strikes caused a massive fire that was visible in satellite imagery 2 days later. All these strikes during October are a continuation of the barrage of strikes on Russian energy facilities that Ukraine has been conducting with vigor since the beginning of August, and had already caused major upheaval in the Russian economy. According to Dr. Richard Connolly, Ukraine's summer offensive of so-called kinetic sanctions have been far more devastating than its campaign against Russian energy facilities in 2024, precisely due to the timing of the campaign. Dr. Connolly is a specialist on the Russian economy, especially its industrial, energy and defense sectors. He's an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI, in London, and has held an adjunct senior fellowship at the Center for New American Security, CNAS. He's authored books including Russia's Response to Sanctions, 2018, and The Russian Economy, A Very Short Introduction, 2020, which address aspects of Russia's economy and its military-industrial complex. In a recent interview on independent reporter Matt Williams's Willie OAM YouTube channel, Dr. Connolly said that while the 2024 strikes were carried out at the end of winter and the beginning of spring, the 2025 strikes focused on the summer. That's when, like in many nations, seasonal demand for fuel is at its highest in Russia. People are traveling for the summer holidays and farmers are harvesting. Fuel supplies are typically strained at this time of the year anyway, so any further pressure on supplies can quickly escalate into a disaster. And increasing pressure on fuel supplies is certainly what Ukraine's strikes are causing. Even before the flurry of strikes in October, Russia's total refining output had fallen to 4.86 million barrels per day, nearly 10% lower than in July and the lowest level in at least 5 years. According to state statistics agency Rosstat, retail gasoline prices rose 2.58% in September, the steepest monthly increase since 2018. Prices were up 12.73% on an annual basis, the fastest pace in 14 years. A BBC investigation a few weeks back found at least 57 regions of Russia had faced interruptions in fuel supplies following Ukrainian strikes on Russian refineries since August, although many of those have subsequently stabilized. Reports by Reuters, Bloomberg, and S&P Global Commodity Insights state that at least 10 businesses, including export-oriented ones, were partially or completely shut down in August and September. According to Sergei Vakulenko, a senior researcher at the Carnegie Berlin Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies, since the July peak, as of early October, the productivity of Russian refineries has decreased by about 10%. This week, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky claimed twice the damage, i.e., that Ukraine's long-range strikes on refineries inside Russia have reduced Moscow's oil refining capacity by 20%. Perhaps he's overstating his case, or maybe Ukraine's October strikes have indeed doubled the damage. But either way, what this loss in refining output means is chaos at the pumps for many ordinary Russians trying to go about their business. Problems with the supply of gasoline don't affect the Russian military to anywhere near the same extent. The military's vehicles run almost exclusively on diesel, whereas the strikes on the refineries primarily affect gasoline. Still, shortages of gas at the pumps hurt ordinary Russians and Russian businesses in ways that Putin might begin to feel even more acutely. Shortages of fuel and the sharp increases in fuel prices that inevitably follow make for unhappy people, and a population feeling the effects of Putin's war in Ukraine in such an acute and direct way is likely to be far less supportive of it than it has been for the most part to date. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, recently declared that Russian citizens are completely united around President Putin and ready to shoulder any burden. But disruptions in the supply of fuel and high prices for it can quickly destabilize all that. In January 2022, a revolt in Kazakhstan over a spike in liquefied petroleum gas prices quickly spiraled into nationwide unrest. Mass protests, looting, and torched government buildings forced a desperate plea for help that brought Russian troops to restore order. Nursultan Nazarbayev, who had ruled Kazakhstan for 3 decades since the Soviet collapse, was forced to step aside in the turmoil's aftermath. Putin is well aware of the potential for similar unrest for similar reasons in Russia, so he and his government have been scrambling to try and stabilize the situation. The first way that the Russians have tried is by banning exports of gasoline and diesel fuel to try and ensure that there's enough fuel available to satisfy domestic demand. The ban actually started back in September 2023, ostensibly to curb price hikes during harvest season amid reports of gasoline shortages in the country's south. Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak said the government was ready for radical measures to curb fuel price hikes caused, among other things, by inflation and an increase in international oil prices. Well, oil prices have receded somewhat since then, but the ban on gasoline exports hasn't. The latest extension, announced by Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak in late September 2025, applies to all exporters and producers and aims to stabilize the domestic market amid persistent disruptions caused, of course, by the Ukrainian strikes. According to Connolly, the ban on exports doesn't deplete the Russian war coffers as much as one might think. He says Russia simply increases its output of crude oil rather than refined gasoline to compensate for the loss in export revenues, and that, depending on the oil price, can actually work out to be more profitable. Still, whatever previously designated for export petrol that's now available domestically certainly hasn't resolved the fuel shortage problem in any meaningful way. If it had, Russia wouldn't have been compelled to greatly increase its imports of gasoline. Yes, that's right. Russia, the world's oil and gasoline superpower, is now importing gasoline to try and rein in its rapidly escalating problem. The first sort of imported gas is Russia's main ally, Belarus. To be fair, Russia usually imports small quantities of gasoline from Belarus, almost all of which was refined from Russian crude in the first place. Russia was also forced to increase fuel imports from Belarus last year to cover shortages, but not at the scale it's currently forced to. Rail-transported gasoline exports from Belarus to Russia jumped fourfold month on month in September to 49,000 metric tons, or 14,500 barrels per day. Gasoline transit from Belarus for further export via Russian ports also edged up by around 1% last month to 140,000 tons, perhaps filling some of the gap left by the ban on Russian gasoline exports. Belarus's 2 refining facilities, the Naftan and Mozir oil refineries, each have an annual capacity of around 240,000 barrels per day, but typically produce around 180,000. To put that into perspective, Russia consumes about 3.8 million barrels per day of oil in all its various forms: crude, gasoline, diesel, aviation fuel, etc. Of that, as of 2023, around 869,000 barrels per day was gasoline. So that September shipment only accounts for less than 2% of Russia's daily requirement. The queues and empty pumps across Russia make clear how much of a dent that's going to make. Belarus only consumes about 24,000 barrels per day domestically, meaning it could export significantly more, theoretically up to around 150,000 barrels per day. In early October, Russian financial gazette Kommersant estimated the gasoline shortage in Russia to be 400,000 tons out of standard monthly supplies of 1 million tons, or 20%. Imports of 150,000 barrels a day from Belarus would be enough to ease the squeeze completely, but large questions remain about whether that's even possible logistically, how long it would take to implement, and how sustainable the measures would be. That's why Russia is also taking some unprecedented measures to import gasoline from elsewhere. Before the war, besides the aforementioned relatively insignificant amounts of gasoline that it imported from Belarus, Russia hardly imported any gasoline from anywhere else. Why would it, when it's exporting endless container ships full of the stuff? It's a different story entirely now. In early October, Novak proposed reducing import customs duties of 5% on imported gasoline from China, South Korea and Singapore to 0. The imports will only be allowed through certain checkpoints in the Russian Far East, and only authorized organizations, Rosneft, NNK, JSC and State Foreign Trade Enterprise, Promsy-Import, would be able to supply fuel. He also proposed allowing the use of monomethyl aniline, or MMA, an octane-increasing additive for gasoline, in its production for 6 months. He reasoned that these moves would make it possible to add at least 350,000 tons of gasoline and 100,000 tons of diesel fuel per month to the domestic market. The addition of MMA to low-octane fuel to produce high-octane Class 5 gasoline will result in a further 50,000 tons of gasoline being made available, he believes. However, it's a controversial move. The MMA additive has been banned in Russia since 2016 to meet European environmental emissions standards. This is not among the cleanest forms of fuel. However, as the European Union continues to move away from Russian hydrocarbons, potentially on a lasting basis, compliance with EU regulations has become less relevant for Russia. It's also apparent that Russia's current fuel shortages have necessitated the adoption of alternative measures. Still, it does signal a loss of confidence in the country's refining base and a willingness to use the market to mask a strategic shortfall, especially if those are signals one wants to see. In a similar vein, Euromaidan press claims that the Russian state seized an energy company named Obolkommenergo from 2 billionaire oligarchs and reassigned it to state control. They say this is further proof of the desperate measures being taken by the Russian government amid collapsing refining capacity. Indeed, while many point to the queues for fuel and embarrassing need to import gasoline as signs that Russia is about to implode, others like Dr. Connolly urge caution in reading too much into it. True, gasoline prices hit historical highs several times over the summer. The average price of gasoline at gas stations across the nation rose by 8.36% from January to September 2025, just over double the inflation rate for the same period of 4.16%, according to official Rosstat data. As of early October, retail gasoline prices had outpaced inflation for the 9th week in a row. Still, that's only an increase of less than 10% year to date. That's less than inflation in Ukraine, and not the sort of number that brings out the pitchforks. Ukraine is clearly causing some major disruptions in certain regions, but they've typically been in the further reaches of this unbelievably large land. The Far East, Crimea and Donetsk, for example. As evident from numerous videos on YouTube from ordinary travelers, the pain hasn't really been felt in Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kazan and the other key central cities. These are the centers where Ukraine would need to cause the kinds of social unrest that they're hoping will bring Putin to the negotiating table on unfavorable terms for Russia, the purpose of the strikes. The problem for Ukraine, according to Dr. Connolly, is that Ukraine still isn't striking Russia's refineries often or hard enough to cause it that level of grief. Partly, that comes down to the massive distances the drones have to travel to reach most of Russia's refineries. The distances mean that the drones can only carry smaller warheads, typically only up to a couple of 100 pounds. And that's simply not enough to cripple Russian refineries, not at one strike per refinery per month or less. He cautions that oil refineries are built to limit damage from explosions in general, for example, by compartmentalizing storage facilities. They do deal with the most flammable of materials after all. They're also typically massive, sprawling enterprises. That means that while a single drone strike with, say, a 300-pound warhead will cause a massive fire and suspend operations, it's extremely unlikely that all output at a large refinery will be halted, and repairs can generally be carried out quite rapidly. Bakulenko of the Carnegie Russia-Eurasia Center corroborates that view, stating that, to date, most refineries have been back operating at near full capacity within a week or two of being struck. Russia has also been observed installing netting and other anti-drone protection at its refineries, and has recently passed a law allowing for the mobilization of veterans of the war to protect these refineries as well. While that doesn't also speak to how much of an issue Ukraine's drone strikes have become, if Ukraine's actions in this regard are any guide, the move should also reduce the effect of these strikes. Connolly also points to Russia's inability to decisively take out Ukraine's energy grid, even with much heavier, more sustained bombardments, as a reason for caution. If Russia lacks the capacity to take out Ukraine's energy systems with a much larger arsenal, it's unreasonable to expect Ukraine to deal more significant damage to Russia's much larger, much more spread out oil refining industry with less firepower, he argues. This is where those long-range missiles Zelensky is trying so hard to secure might change the status quo significantly. But in the meantime, Ukraine's strikes on Russian refineries during the past few months haven't gone unanswered. Russia's relentless retaliatory bombardments of Ukrainian power and gas facilities have already forced most of the country to endure rolling emergency blackouts or worse. The start of the heating season has been delayed, and a growing number of authorities are warning about a very difficult winter ahead. The reality is that Russia's war machine is cracking under pressure. Ukraine's relentless strikes have exposed the Kremlin's deep vulnerabilities, not just on the battlefield, but at home, where fuel shortages, economic strain, and public discontent are mounting. The illusion of control that Putin tries to project is fading fast. In August of 2024, Russia appeared to be on the brink of a major victory. According to reports at the time, its troops were mere days away from capturing the city of Pokrovsk, an invaluable Ukrainian stronghold situated in the Donetsk region. Over a year has passed, yet still the city remains in Ukraine's control. Even now, despite having 8 times as many troops as its opponent, the Russian army continues to make zero progress in Pokrovsk, suffering one humiliating loss after another. It's a remarkable story, a testament to Ukraine's inspiring resilience and extraordinary ability to dig in and defend its most valuable strategic locations, as well as yet more evidence of Russia's astonishing incompetence. And it all began over a year ago, in the summer of 2024. In that late July and early August, Russian forces made several sweeping gains at a fairly rapid rate, taking control of various villages and small settlements dotted around central Donetsk like Progress and Lozovatske. Each capture brought them closer to Pokrovsk, and fears began to rise that the city was close to falling into enemy hands. With Russian forces gaining ground by the day, with Serhiy Dobryak, head of the Pokrovsk city military administration, ordering an evacuation on August 15. Today, the Russian army has come very close to the Pokrovsk community, with their forces positioned just over 10 kilometers from the outskirts of Pokrovsk. They're targeting critical infrastructure as well as residential buildings, resulting in civilian casualties. Meanwhile, numerous news agencies across the world publish grim reports of the ongoing situation. The Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Oleksandr Syrsky, confirmed that the fighting in the Pokrovsk direction was more intense than anywhere else along the front lines, and even the nation's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was understandably concerned about the city's future, stating that summer, "Today, Russian forces are concentrating the largest number of personnel, the largest number of weapons and cab bombs, everything they have, in the Pokrovsk direction." The situation seemed bleak, and it was made even worse by the fact that Russian forces outnumbered Ukrainians in the area by around 4-1, with an estimated 20 Russian regiments and brigades operating east of Pokrovsk at the time, for a grand total of approximately 40,000 troops. Ukraine, meanwhile, could only field 6 brigades in the area, with around 12,000 troops in total doing whatever they could to defend the city and its surrounding settlements. With every passing day, the Russians drew closer. It appeared that even in the best-case scenario, Ukraine's defenders might be able to slow the enemy's advances once they reached the city limits, perhaps preventing them from gaining full control right away, but the fall of Pokrovsk appeared inevitable before the end of 2024. Then, something extraordinary happened. Russia's progress began to slow, then stall. Days and weeks went by, but the long-awaited announcement that the Kremlin had captured the city never came. Instead of rolling into Pokrovsk with their tanks and armored vehicles, overwhelming any defenses in their way and steamrolling to victory, Russian forces found that the city was far harder to capture than they might have expected. So, even though they managed to take some of the surrounding lands and partly encircled the city, the all-important breakthrough never came. 2024 came to a close, and Russia had failed to achieve its objective. And as 2025 kicked off, the situation in the Pokrovsk sector descended into something of a stalemate. Russia's slow but steady progress came to a grinding halt, and Ukraine even managed to push the enemy back and recapture some of its lost land, with the front line becoming somewhat stable for the first time in a long time. Evidently, Russia's leadership wasn't too pleased about this turn of events. So, in March of this year, the Russian army stepped up its efforts to take the city, deploying every possible tactic they could think of in their quest for victory. They used tanks, artillery and bombs to strike Pokrovsk and surrounding settlements, attempted to further encircle the city and sever its supply lines by marching onto another nearby city, Dobropilya, and even sent sabotage groups into the city itself, disguised as local civilians, to spread chaos from within. None of it worked. Demonstrating yet more of their inherent innovation and ability to adapt in the face of adversity, Ukraine found ways to counter every single thing the Russians threw their way. They used drones, mines, and more to stop tanks and armor advancing on the city, launching a successful counter-offensive in the Dobropilya direction to isolate enemy units, and even found ways, with the aid of local Pokrovsk residents, to identify and snuff out the saboteurs one by one. So, Russia ramped things up even further. In the summer months, as part of its major summer offensive, the Russians amassed a truly gigantic force of around 110,000 troops, along with over 500 tanks, close to 700 armored fighting vehicles, over 560 artillery pieces, and more than 180 multiple launch rocket systems of varying calibers, all in the Pokrovsk area. This time, failure was not an option, and the Kremlin was confident of victory. Putin himself was desperate to capture Pokrovsk ahead of highly anticipated talks with US President Donald Trump, seemingly believing that taking the city at last would show the world that Russia was winning the war, and that Ukraine and its allies had no other option but to wave the white flag and submit to a peace deal negotiated on Russia's terms. Still, the city stood firm, seeing out the summer months and remaining in Ukraine's control once again. Which leads all the way up to the present day and Russia's latest desperate attempts to assert dominance in the area. According to the most recent reports, Russian troops have long last, after well over a year of effort, reached the outskirts of Pokrovsk, and street fighting is ongoing between the two sides. The Russians outnumber the Ukrainians by around 8-1, yet are still struggling to make gains and achieve their aims, as the city remains, for the time being, in Ukraine's hands, with Zelensky stating on October 28, "Imagine how many Russian forces are there, but at the same time, they'd have not achieved the planned result." It's another embarrassing result for the Kremlin. Even with a force that's so much larger than that of the opposing side, its army is still suffering failure after failure and loss after loss, with reports also revealing that Ukraine captured approximately 2,200 Russian soldiers in the region in the first 6 months of this year alone. Countless more have been wounded or killed in the multitude of poorly planned and pathetically coordinated assaults on the city over the course of 2025, and many more are likely to perish in the days and weeks of intense urban combat that lie ahead. Still, Russia is throwing everything it's got at the city. It reportedly has 10 times as many drones as Ukraine in the sector, according to Ukraine military sources, and some of its soldiers are repeating the sabotage strategy seen earlier in the summer, in which troops disguise themselves as civilians in order to sneak past defensive lines and infiltrate the city's center. The Russians also, unfortunately, now have fire control over all egress routes from the city, since they've managed to capture so much of the surrounding land. Because of this, it's no longer possible to safely evacuate the remaining residents. Around 1,200 civilians still live in Pokrovsk, which is only a small fraction of the city's pre-war population of more than 60,000 people. Still, it's many innocent lives that are at an increasing risk, as the Russian army doesn't have the best track record when it comes to their treatment of civilians in wartime. Indeed, reports have already emerged that Russian soldiers are opening fire on locals, as noted in a recent post from the Institute for the Study of War. Russian tactics in Pokrovsk have entrapped civilians within the city, intensifying the risk of indiscriminate civilian harm. The Ukrainian Pokrovsk military administration reported that Russian forces have fire control over all egress routes from Pokrovsk, effectively entrapping 1,200 civilians within Pokrovsk. The Pokrovsk military administration reported that Russian forces are killing civilians who attempt to evacuate both on foot and in vehicles. Thankfully, for the time being, Ukrainian forces are still able to provide food, water, and medical assistance to those that are, in effect, trapped within the city's limits, and will continue to do whatever they can to keep the local people safe from harm. There's no doubt that Ukraine's grasp of the city has started to weaken. Small squadrons of Russian soldiers are making their way through the city streets, while Ukrainian defenders are dispatched to hunt them down and take them out. The fate of the city rests in the balance, but the fact that Ukraine has held it for this long and continues to claim control of large sections of the city is a huge victory in and of itself. Russia thought it would capture this city months ago. It expected to be fully in control by now and well on the way towards taking over other locations along the famous fortress belt of Donetsk, like Kramatorsk and Slovyansk, or delve deeper into the country and ever closer to its capital, Kyiv. Putin expected that he'd be able to announce Pokrovsk capture to the masses back in the summer and boast about his army's advances in his discussions with Trump and other world leaders. Instead, even now, with Russian soldiers actually in the city, the Kremlin head is still waiting for news of the victory that, in his view, is long overdue. And he might be waiting quite a while longer, as Ukraine's defenders are holding strong and have no plans of leaving Pokrovsk anytime soon. One Ukrainian major, whose brigade is stationed in the area, confirmed that there are no current plans to retreat, stating, "We're holding the city for now, it's stable chaos in there." The major, who preferred to remain anonymous when speaking with reporters, added that around 200 to 250 Russian forces have built up on the southern side of the city. The current combat situation is street fighting. This represents a big shift in the combat dynamic. For a long time, much of the fighting for Pokrovsk took place on the outskirts and surrounding territories of the city, including fields, farmland, rural roads, and small settlements, with long lines of sight and wide areas of open ground. This allowed Ukrainian drones to operate with a reasonable degree of freedom and flexibility, soaring across open skies to spot their targets on the ground before honing in and wiping them out. Now, it's a completely different situation, with troops facing off against one another in city streets, relying on rubble, wrecked vehicles, and other debris to give them cover as they exchange fire with their enemies. Fortunately, Ukraine has a huge advantage here, as it knows the city well. This is Ukrainian territory after all, and many of Kyiv's soldiers have been stationed in and around Pokrovsk for many months now. They know every street, every turn, every corner, and they've proven on countless occasions that they're more than capable of making the absolute most of its home turf advantage. It might not be enough to allow them to keep the city forever, but it may be just what they need to delay Russia's advances and perhaps hold out long enough for reinforcements or additional weapons to arrive. And reinforcements are already en route. The major, who spoke to the media, confirmed that Ukrainian Special Forces units and assault squads were entering the area to bolster Pokrovsk's defenses and, in his words, clean out the Russian troops that had made it inside. This was backed up by President Zelensky, who spoke to reporters on Monday. Ukraine's leader confirmed that, according to satellite imagery and Ukrainian drone operator reports, around 200 Russians were inside the city. He also explained that defensive positions in and around the area were being actively strengthened, and Ukraine's drones were scanning the skies to assess the situation and gather important intelligence to help the armed forces plan their next steps. Zelensky acknowledged that capturing Pokrovsk was clearly a top priority objective for the Kremlin, and that the enemy had vastly superior numbers and resources, but remained confident that his troops would continue to show the same courage and resilience that's become synonymous with the Ukrainian people over the last few years. He claimed that as soon as Russian soldiers crawl out from wherever they're hiding, or as soon as there is fire from one point or another, enemy forces are found and destroyed. Zelensky also highlighted two important takeaways from this situation. First, because Russia is so hell-bent on taking Pokrovsk by any means necessary, it's diverted forces and resources from other areas along the front lines. That means that certain sectors are now weaker, which may present opportunities for one or more Ukrainian counter-offensives further along the front. Ukraine has proven in the past that it's able to think tactically, identify weaknesses in its enemy, and strike at just the right times, in just the right places to deal lasting damage. It may, therefore, already be looking at other areas in Donetsk, Luhansk, or other regions where Russia's offensive forces have thinned, and it could carry out one or more surprise attacks of its own in the days and weeks ahead. Second, Zelensky pointed to the fact that the almost miraculous ongoing defense of Pokrovsk is clear proof that international aid to Ukraine is incredibly valuable and capable of making a real difference on the battlefield. It's only thanks to Ukraine's many allies and all the weapons, supplies, munitions and funds they've provided that the country's forces have been able to dig in and defend themselves for this long. As long as aid keeps coming, they should be able to maintain those same superhuman levels of resilience, not just in Pokrovsk, but other important towns and cities across their territory. Zelensky summed up by saying that Ukraine is still in control of Pokrovsk and Russia is repeatedly being forced to postpone its campaign plans, while also suffering heavy losses in both the Pokrovsk and Dobropilya sectors, where Ukrainian operations continue to nullify the enemy's endless offensives. It's worth noting too that Russia has not captured a single major Ukrainian city since taking Avdiivka, a major Donetsk stronghold, in February 2024. Prior to that, one of the Kremlin's most notable victories was in the bloody battle for Bakhmut, which began in July 2022, over 3 years ago. Some observers have likened that battle to the ongoing offensive in Pokrovsk, but according to the Ukrainian major at the scene, there's no comparison between the two. People are trying to compare it to Bakhmut, but these are different situations. Here, there aren't as many of them Russians, and most of them are just hiding somewhere in basements. As the major notes, Ukraine is not yet facing some sort of overwhelming, inescapable enemy offensive. It's not having to deal with dozens of tanks and armored vehicles rampaging through its city streets, or huge numbers of troops firing their AK-74s at Ukrainian fortifications. Instead, this is a relatively small and disparate Russian force, with many enemy troops simply hiding out and trying to survive while they wait for reinforcement, rather than attempting a big aggressive push deeper into the city. Several other Ukrainian sources confirmed that the situation has not yet reached any sort of critical status at this time. The Air Assault Forces 7th Corps, for example, which is fighting in Pokrovsk at this very moment, wrote a lengthy Telegram post detailing the situation. The defenders of Pokrovsk are actively countering the occupiers in the city. Recently, our defense was strengthened with new units, in particular assault troops, artillery, UAV crews, and other components of the defense forces. We're increasing the use of anti-aircraft drones and net launchers against enemy Mavics. Additionally, we're remotely mining the enemy's infiltration routes. On October 25-26, Ukrainian soldiers killed about 40 Russians in Pokrovsk. The occupiers who have entered the city are not trying to gain a foothold, but intend to advance further north. In this way, the enemy wants to disperse our defense forces and block the land logistic corridors to the city. So, at the moment, there is no talk of full control over any of the districts of Pokrovsk. On the Russian side, as usual, news reports paint a very different picture. On October 26, the head of Russia's army, General Valery Gerasimov, told Vladimir Putin directly that the Kremlin's forces had encircled around 5,500 Ukrainian soldiers in Pokrovsk and 5,000 more in the Kharkiv region, many miles away. However, think tanks like the ISW have found absolutely zero evidence to back up these claims, suggesting that Gerasimov is either exaggerating or completely making up stories and statistics to suggest that Russia is doing far better than it actually is. ISW has not observed evidence to support Gerasimov's claims. ISW continues to assess that Russian forces are making gains near and within Pokrovsk and Mirnorad that are tactically significant but likely do not portend to the imminent collapse of Ukrainian defenses in the area. It's not uncommon for Russia to blatantly lie about its battlefield exploits, and the ISW, along with other analyst groups, argues that this is all part of a broader Kremlin strategy based around misinformation. If Russia can convince the world that it's winning the war and making gains in key areas, it should be able to enjoy a more powerful position at the negotiating table and achieve the peace or ceasefire deal it desires. Fortunately, much of the world can clearly see through Putin's lies and propaganda. And no matter what the Kremlin says, the truth is that it has spent over a year attempting to take a single city and is still failing to do so, even now. In a more recent report, published on October 28, the ISW went further, stating that Russian advances remain unlikely to cause any kind of immediate collapse of the Ukrainian pocket in the Pokrovsk direction. The ISW also states that the front line around Pokrovsk is now in a fluid state, with both sides making gains in different areas. So, even as Russian troops enter more of Pokrovsk's city streets, Ukrainian armed forces are not simply standing still and have been seen assaulting Russian positions elsewhere, like in Rodinske, north of Pokrovsk, to forge their own advances. It's not unthinkable to imagine that with enough reinforcements, resources, and aid from allies around the world, Ukraine could once more stage a stunning comeback here, wiping out the small numbers of Russian troops in the city and fortifying their positions all over again. In short, even though the Russians have made some headway, the situation remains in a state of flux. Both sides are poking and prodding at one another, making gains and suffering losses as the days go by. But Ukraine has the home advantage and the benefit of strong defensive positions that have been steadily solidified over the months and years. If the city eventually does fall, it will be a big loss for Ukraine and cause for celebration for Russia. But there will still be many more defensive strongholds just like this one standing in the Kremlin's way of total conquest, and countless brave Ukrainian soldiers ready and waiting to hold the line. Now, learn more about how Russia is desperately attempting to exaggerate its frontline successes in this video, which looks at how the Kremlin recently staged a victory in Kherson, only to be utterly embarrassed less than 24 hours later when Ukrainian troops debunked their claims. Or, for another example of misplaced Russian arrogance, watch this video, revealing how Russian troops celebrated far too early before the harsh and unexpected reality caught them completely off guard. And finally, make sure to subscribe to our channel too, to watch more informative, insightful, and up-to-date video reports about the Russia-Ukraine war and other important conflicts around the world.